He had always loved the quiet life. Away from the noise of the city, the cabin sat on the edge of a small forest, surrounded by tall pines and a few scattered homes. The smell of fresh earth, the sound of birds singing, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind had become a kind of therapy for him. Each weekend, he would pack a small bag, lock the front door of his city apartment, and drive the long, winding road to his little refuge. The cabin was modest, just a few rooms with a kitchen, a living area, and a small loft for sleeping. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. It was perfect in its simplicity. He had bought it years ago, long before the neighborhood had grown into a more organized community. Back then, it had been a collection of scattered cabins, a few families who knew each other, and a lot of open land. Over time, houses appeared, lawns were mowed, and roads were paved. Eventually, the residents decided to form a homeowners association, or HOA, to set rules and maintain certain standards. He had always stayed on the outskirts of their social life, preferring the solitude of his cabin to the chatter of meetings and newsletters. He never imagined it would one day become a source of conflict. The first sign that something was wrong came in the mail. At first, he thought it was just a routine notice. He opened the envelope carefully, expecting some mundane update about dues or minor maintenance. But the letter inside was far from ordinary. It was typed, formal, and carried the official logo of the HOA. As he read it, his stomach sank. The words were direct, almost cold. They claimed his cabin violated certain rules, citing specific sections of the HOA agreement. There were threats of fines and potential legal action if the issues were not addressed immediately. At first, it could not believe it. The cabin had been standing for years without complaint. No one had ever mentioned any violations. He reread the letter, hoping he had misunderstood something. But the instructions were clear. Either comply with the HOA's demands or face consequences. There was no room for negotiation, no acknowledgement of his years of ownership, no sense that anyone cared about the history or the effort he had put into his home away from home. He sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the letter, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could this happen? He had always paid attention to his surroundings, kept the property tidy, and followed the rules of the area. The idea that a group of neighbors, some of whom he barely knew, could dictate what he did with his own property felt absurd. Yet the letter was real, the threat was real. And now he had to figure out what to do. The first instinct was to call someone. Maybe a friend who knew about these things. Or perhaps even the HOA directly to clarify. But he paused. Something told him that approaching them hastily might make things worse. There was a certain arrogance in the way the letter was written, an assumption that he would simply comply without question. That thought stirred something in him up. Determination not to be bullied, he decided to take a walk around his property to clear his mind. The air was crisp, and the late afternoon sun painted the trees in shades of gold and amber. He walked past the small garden he had planted, the wooden deck he had built with his own hands, and the small dock by the creek where he sometimes fished. Each familiar sight reminded him why he loved this place and why the idea of losing it was so unsettling. This cabin wasn't just a structure. It was a part of his life, a place where he could breathe freely and be himself as he walked. He tried to imagine what the HOA could be thinking. Maybe they believed he had made additions without approval. Or perhaps they thought his property didn't match their standards. He knew some neighbors had complained in the past about minor things, but nothing serious. The idea that someone had the authority to threaten his home over technicalities felt unreal. Yet, the letter was proof that the situation was real. He had no choice but to confront it, but he knew he had to do it carefully. That night, he sat down with a cup of tea and began to write notes. He listed every detail about the cabin when it was built, the improvements he had made, the way he had maintained the property. He also noted the timeline of ownership, remembering conversations with previous neighbors and reviewing old receipts and documents. Each piece of information he gathered added to his confidence that he had done nothing wrong, but he also realized that he needed more than memory. He needed proof, and he needed to understand the HOA's rules fully. The next day, he visited the local government office to check records. The clerk was helpful, guiding him to property maps and zoning information. As he flipped through the old files, he noticed that his cabin had been there long before the HOA existed, that the land was zoned appropriately, and that there were no formal restrictions that applied retroactively. A small smile appeared on his face. He was not defenseless. There was a legal foundation beneath him, something solid that could not be easily ignored. Even with this knowledge, he knew the battle would not be easy. The HOA had a reputation for being strict and somewhat inflexible. Other homeowners had been intimidated in the past, paying fines or making unnecessary changes just to avoid conflict. He had heard stories of long meetings, heated arguments, and neighbors turning against each other. The thought of entering that world of bureaucracy made him anxious, but it also strengthened his resolve. He had come too far and cared too much to back down. In the days that followed, he observed quietly. HOA members passed by, sometimes glancing at his property with what seemed like scrutiny. Occasionally, they would leave pamphlets or notices in the mailbox, each one more formal than the last. He resisted the urge to respond immediately, knowing that anger or rash decisions could be used against him. Instead, he focused on documenting everything: the dates, the interactions, the tone of the letters. He took photographs of the cabin, the yard, and even small details that might be relevant. Every action was a small step toward preparing himself for whatever confrontation might come. He also began speaking discreetly with a few longtime neighbors, people who had lived in the area for decades. They shared stories about the formation of the HOA, the original rules, and some of the misunderstandings that had occurred in the past. Some neighbors were sympathetic, quietly suggesting that the HOA sometimes overstepped its boundaries. Others were cautious, warning him that the board could be difficult to challenge. Each conversation added pieces to the puzzle, helping him understand not just the legal side, but also the human dynamics at play. One evening, as he sat on the deck watching the sun sink behind the trees, he thought about the cabin and what it meant to him. It was more than wood and nails. It was memories of quiet mornings, nights spent by the fireplace, and weekends spent with books and music. The thought of losing it or being forced to comply with unfair demands filled him with a quiet determination. He knew that whatever came next, he had to be strategic, patient, and unwavering. The cabin was his sanctuary. He would not give it up without a fight. He began drafting letters of his own, carefully wording them to be respectful but firm. He would ask for clarification on the alleged violations and request evidence supporting their claims. He knew that presenting himself calmly and reasonably would give him an advantage. Anger or rash decisions could be twisted into admissions or weaknesses. By staying composed, he hoped to turn the situation in his favor, or at least prevent it from escalating unnecessarily. As the first week passed, the tension grew. Each time he checked the mailbox, his heart raced. Another letter arrived, this one more insistent, demanding immediate action and threatening escalating fines. He read it carefully, underlining key phrases, noting inconsistencies, and making a mental plan. The threats no longer frightened him as they had at first. Instead, they reinforced his determination. This was a challenge, yes, but not an insurmountable one. With preparation, patience, and clear evidence, he could protect what was rightfully his. By the end of the week, he'd gathered a folder full of documents, maps, photographs, and notes. He had also consulted a legal guide on property rights and HOAs, gaining a better understanding of the framework that governed his land. For the first time since receiving that initial letter, he felt a sense of control. The situation was serious, but it was not hopeless. He realized that the HOA had assumed power, but they did not yet understand the full history or the facts supporting his ownership. The sun was setting again as he stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. In that stillness, he made a promise to himself. He would not be intimidated. He would not allow threats to dictate the life he had built in this little corner of the world. He would act with patience, with clarity, and with evidence. The cabin had stood for years, long before the HOA. It would continue to stand. As night fell and the stars appeared above the treetops, he felt a quiet strength settle over him. The challenge was only beginning, but he was ready. The next steps would require courage, careful planning, and a steady mind. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace sitting on the deck, listening to the sounds of the forest and remembering why this place meant so much. Whatever the HOA thought, whatever letters came next, he knew he would face them on his own terms. And so, the first chapter of this confrontation ended not with conflict, but with preparation, reflection, and determination. The cabin stood quietly under the night sky, a symbol of his patience and resolve, ready for whatever came next. Days passed since the first letter arrived, and he noticed a change in the neighborhood. It was subtle at first, neighbors glancing his way, the occasional murmur when he walked past, and a few unfamiliar cars parked on the streets near his cabin. It was clear that word of the HOA's warning had spread. At first he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on organizing his documents and reviewing property records. But the sense of being watched grew. Each time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of eyes, sometimes distant, sometimes closer than he expected. One morning, while fixing a loose board on the deck, he saw a black SUV slow down near his driveway. Two people stepped out, clipboard in hand. They introduced themselves as representatives from the HOA. Their tone was polite but firm. They said they were there to inspect the property and ensure compliance with the community rules. He had expected them eventually, but the way they spoke, as though he had no right to even question their presence, felt invasive. He listened calmly, answering their questions with brief, factual statements. They took notes, measured the boundaries of his cabin, and even snapped photos of small details around the yard. All the while, he noticed subtle signs of judgment in their glances. Perhaps they assumed he had made changes without permission, or maybe they simply wanted to assert control. He kept his voice steady and avoided showing frustration, even though every fiber of him wanted to challenge them on the spot. After the inspection, one of the representatives mentioned that the HOA might need to take further action unless certain corrections were made. He asked for specific details and documentation, and they promised to provide it. Even as they drove away, the sense of unease lingered. He realized that the fight was becoming more personal. It wasn't just about letters in the mail anymore. It was about people standing at his doorstep, judging and threatening. Over the next few days, the tension in the air grew heavier. He noticed neighbors speaking in hushed tones whenever he walked by. Some seemed sympathetic, giving him small smiles or nods, while others avoided eye contact, as though they were choosing sides quietly. The HOA's presence was becoming more tangible, more deliberate. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, and he even found one left at his cabin that summarized the rules, emphasizing compliance or consequences. The words were carefully chosen to intimidate, and he felt their intent clearly. Despite the pressure, he refused to react hastily. Each letter and flyer he received was cataloged meticulously. He kept a notebook with the dates, descriptions, and any subtle threats or warnings. Even the tone of the representatives' voices during visits was noted. He understood that this record-keeping might be crucial if the situation escalated. His calm demeanor masked a growing determination. He would not let intimidation replace reason, and he would not allow fear to control his decisions. He spent time speaking quietly with neighbors who had lived in the area for decades. One elderly man, whose family had been there since before the HOA existed, offered insight. "They think they can control everything now," the man said, shaking his head. "But some of us remember when the rules didn't exist. They can try, but history is on your side." This gave him a subtle reassurance. He realized that the HOA's authority was not absolute. It was built on assumptions, social pressure, and the fear of confrontation. With careful planning, those assumptions could be challenged. One afternoon, while walking near the creek behind his cabin, he reflected on the situation. He felt a mix of frustration and clarity. The HOA's tactics were not just about enforcing rules, they were about testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push someone before compliance. He understood that if he reacted emotionally, if he let anger guide his decisions, he might give them an advantage. Patience, observation, and preparation were now his strongest allies. He decided to enhance his records further. He took photographs of every angle of his property, including small features that might be mentioned as violations. He documented the garden, the deck, and the shed he had built years ago. Each photo had a date and description, forming a visual history of the cabin's state over time. He also copied receipts for materials, maintenance logs, and records of any improvements. It was tedious work, but he knew that being thorough could make the difference between compliance under duress and defending his rights. The HOA representatives returned a week later, this time without notice. They approached with the same confident tone, implying that the previous inspection had revealed deficiencies. He welcomed them politely, asking for specific evidence of violations. They mentioned minor issues: paint colors not matching guidelines, the deck's railing slightly different from the HOA-approved design, and the shed's placement. Each claim was technical, almost trivial, but framed as serious breaches. He responded calmly, presenting photographs and documentation showing that the changes had existed long before any HOA rule applied, or that they were within permissible variations. The room became quiet, and for a moment, he saw the surprise in their eyes. They had assumed immediate compliance, but here was someone prepared, factual, and unwavering. He kept his tone neutral, avoiding any hint of anger. Yet the clarity of his argument spoke volumes. After they left, he knew the battle was only beginning. The HOA might still try other tactics: letters, fines, or even legal action, but he felt a small sense of control returning. Each interaction reinforced his understanding that the situation was about more than rules. It was about persistence and strategy. He couldn't allow intimidation to determine the outcome. His approach needed to combine patience, knowledge, and careful observation. He began spending more time at the cabin, not just maintaining it physically, but monitoring the neighborhood's subtle dynamics. He noticed which neighbors had influence within the HOA, who appeared to support them, and who quietly questioned their authority. Every casual conversation, every glance, every unspoken reaction became information he could use. He understood that social dynamics often mattered as much as legal documents when dealing with such organizations. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, he reflected on the difference between fear and respect. The HOA relied on fear to assert authority, but he realized that respect, combined with knowledge and patience, could be more powerful. By staying calm and informed, he was gradually shifting the balance. He didn't need to fight with anger. He just needed to show that he understood his rights and that he would act wisely. The next day, he received another letter. This one was sharper in tone, suggesting fines and potential escalation if compliance was not immediate. He read it carefully, underlining key phrases and noting inconsistencies with previous notices. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he added the letter to his growing file of documentation. Each new threat reinforced his resolve. The pattern was clear. The HOA attempted to pressure residents quickly, but with careful attention and methodical response, their power could be checked. He also began researching local HOA laws and past cases. He discovered stories of residents who had successfully challenged overreaching boards by being meticulous and informed. Each case he read provided insights into potential strategies, from formal letters to legal consultations. He realized that knowledge, combined with patience, would be his strongest weapon. Preparation was no longer optional, it was essential. The tension escalated when neighbors started subtly asking questions. Some were curious, asking about the letters, the inspections, and what might happen next. Others were quiet but observant, clearly aware of the unfolding conflict. He remained careful in his responses, sharing just enough to be truthful without revealing too much strategy. He understood that information, both given and withheld, could shape perceptions and outcomes. One morning, he found the HOA president standing near his property speaking to a small group of residents. The president waved casually, but made no direct threat. It was a silent show of authority, a reminder that the HOA was watching. He did not react publicly. Instead, he continued his work on the cabin, confident that composure would speak louder than confrontation. He noticed subtle signs of hesitation among some of the board members. His quiet preparation and clear documentation were already causing doubt. He also strengthened his connections with supportive neighbors. They offered advice, shared observations, and quietly expressed solidarity. While their support was not a solution on its own, it provided reassurance that he was not entirely isolated. These small alliances became part of his broader strategy. Offering both moral support and practical insight, days turned into weeks. And each interaction with the HOA, each letter, and each inspection added layers to the situation. The pressure was constant, but he adapted. He documented more meticulously, observed more carefully, and refined his approach. The cabin remained in perfect condition, not as a show of defiance, but as evidence of his care and commitment. Every detail, from the freshly painted railing to the well-kept garden, was a silent argument in his favor. He also began rehearsing how he might present his case if required. He imagined the scenarios, letters, meetings, inspections, and practiced responding calmly, clearly, and respectfully. Each mental rehearsal strengthened his confidence. He knew that when the time came to confront the HOA formally, his composure and clarity would be as important as the documents he had. Gathered, evenings at the cabin became moments of reflection. He wrote notes, reviewed records, and planned each step. The quiet forest, the rustling leaves, and the distant call of birds became a sanctuary where he could think strategically. He understood that patience was not passive. It was active preparation. Every small action, every careful observation, brought him closer to the point where he could protect his home without unnecessary conflict. By the end of the second part of this journey, he realized that the HOA's threats, while intimidating, were not undefeatable. The combination of preparation, documentation, careful observation, and quiet strategy had already shifted the balance. He was no longer merely reacting, he was positioning himself to respond effectively. The cabin, standing silently among the trees, remained a symbol of persistence and careful planning. Ready for whatever the next step might bring, he spent the next few days deep in research, determined to understand every detail about his cabin, the land it stood on, and the rules the HOA claimed he had violated. He knew that knowledge was the only way to protect himself. Sitting at the small kitchen table, he spread out old property records, maps, and documents he had gathered over the years. Each sheet of paper told a story of ownership, improvement, and history that stretched back long before the HOA existed. He began with the property records. The cabin had been built decades ago, with proper permits at the time, and the land had always been zoned for residential use. The HOA, formed much later, could not retroactively enforce rules on something that was already in place legally. This was a critical discovery. He felt a spark of hope, realizing that the foundation of their threat might already be flawed. Still, he knew the HOA would not simply accept this without effort. Next, he examined old maps of the area. He found the initial surveys, showing property boundaries and structures. His cabin appeared clearly on maps that predated the formation of the HOA. He traced the lot lines carefully, marking every corner and checking them against modern maps. The physical evidence aligned with the legal records. Each detail he uncovered strengthened his position, giving him confidence that he was not only right but prepared to prove it. He also dug into the history of the neighborhood. Through local archives and conversations with longtime residents, he discovered that several other homes and cabins had been standing before the HOA rules were established. Some had been adjusted to meet new standards, but many had not. In each case, the HOA had been cautious, avoiding conflicts where the law clearly favored the property owner. This reinforced his understanding that a careful, well-documented response could protect him. While researching, he found a file of past correspondence between the HOA and residents. He read accounts of fines, complaints, and resolutions. What stood out was how often the HOA relied on intimidation rather than facts. Many residents had paid fines or made unnecessary changes just to avoid conflict. Others had challenged the board and succeeded, but only after meticulous documentation and persistence. This pattern reassured him that patience and preparation were his best allies. He made notes on each piece of evidence, creating a timeline. From the moment he purchased the cabin to the arrival of the threatening letters, Every event was recorded with dates and details. He included photographs he had taken of the cabin over the years, highlighting that it had remained consistent with past records. Even small improvements like repainting or repairing the deck were documented with receipts and dates. The more he compiled, the clearer it became. The HOA's claims were based on assumptions, not facts. Realizing that preparation alone was not enough, he considered the next step. He needed to confront the situation formally, but on his terms. He could not rely on casual conversations or hope that the board would simply accept his evidence. He needed a plan. He created a list of what he would need for a meeting: property records, maps, photographs, receipts, notes on past inspections, and a clear statement of his position. Each item was essential to ensure he could speak with authority. He also thought about the people he might face. The HOA board members had been confident, sometimes dismissive, and occasionally aggressive in their tone. He knew that when presenting his evidence, he needed to maintain calm, avoid anger, and stay focused on facts. The emotional impact of confidence and composure could be as important as the documents themselves. If he reacted emotionally, even just frustration could be used against him. As he organized his materials, he noticed a pattern in the HOA's communications. They often cited vague rules without specifying exactly how he had violated them. They mentioned fines and potential legal action, but rarely provided concrete evidence. This approach relied on fear to gain compliance. Understanding this, he realized that if he demanded specificity and evidence, they would have to respond with facts, and that was where his preparation would give him the advantage. He spent hours cross-referencing documents, matching photographs to property surveys, and checking dates against receipts. Every detail had to be precise. If the HOA tried to challenge a minor discrepancy, he needed a clear explanation. The process was tedious, but he approached it methodically. Each moment of preparation reduced the uncertainty and anxiety he felt. Replacing it with confidence in his ability to defend himself, he also considered legal advice. While he did not want to immediately escalate the situation, he wanted to understand his rights fully. He read guides on property law, HOA regulations, and resident protections. Each passage he studied gave him more clarity about the limitations of the HOA's authority and the avenues available if they tried to overstep. He felt empowered, knowing that his knowledge could prevent them from bullying him into submission. During this time, he continued observing the neighborhood. The subtle dynamics between neighbors and HOA members became more apparent. He noticed who had influence, who seemed uncertain, and who quietly supported him. Each observation was another piece of the puzzle. He realized that the conflict was not only about legal authority, but also social perception. By staying calm and factual, he could shape how others viewed the situation and reduce unnecessary opposition. One afternoon, he found an old surveyor's report from the year the cabin was built. The measurements matched the current structure perfectly. The surveyor had documented every feature of the property from the foundation to the deck. With notes about compliance with building codes at the time, he photocopied the pages and added them to his file. This was exactly the kind of hard evidence that could counter any vague claims by the HOA. He also discovered letters from previous owners, describing improvements and repairs and confirming that the cabin had always been maintained according to local regulations. These letters, though old, were formal and specific. They provided a chain of history showing that the cabin had existed legally long before the HOA's rules came into play. Each document reinforced the narrative he would eventually present. The cabin was legitimate. The improvements were lawful, and the HOA's claims lacked factual basis. As he compiled his evidence, he realized that preparation alone would not be enough. He needed a strategy for presentation. How he spoke, how he organized the documents, and how he addressed questions would be critical. He made notes on the order in which he would present evidence, anticipating objections and thinking through clear, concise responses. He imagined the potential scenarios, rehearsing mentally how to stay composed and factual, regardless of the board's demeanor. He also considered timing. If he responded too quickly, he might appear reactive. If he waited too long, the HOA might escalate further. He needed the right moment, a formal meeting where he could present his case thoroughly and publicly if necessary. This realization led him to plan a letter requesting an official meeting. It would be polite but firm, emphasizing his desire to clarify the facts and resolve the issue. By requesting a structured forum, he could control the environment and reduce surprises. During his research, he also discovered an overlooked aspect of the rules. Certain sections of the HOA regulations only applied to new construction or modifications after a specific date. His cabin, built long before that date, was explicitly exempt. This detail was critical. It meant that some of the HOA's claims were not just vague, they were legally irrelevant. He highlighted this section in his documents. Knowing it could decisively undermine their authority, he spent evenings at the cabin going through each document, map, and photograph. He annotated notes, creating a system to quickly reference key points. This level of organization gave him a sense of control he had not felt since the initial letters arrived. The more he prepared, the more he realized that fear had no place in this process. Knowledge, clarity, and patience were his tools, and he would rely on them fully. He also reflected on the psychological aspect of the confrontation. The HOA relied on intimidation and uncertainty. By staying calm, factual, and prepared, he could neutralize their tactics. He knew that confidence combined with evidence could shift the dynamic. If he presented himself clearly and respectfully, he could force them to respond with facts rather than threats. The realization was empowering. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to chat, curious about his routine visits to the property records office and his careful note-taking. He shared general information but avoided revealing his strategy. Some offered advice, others expressed support. While their input was helpful, he knew that the core of the situation rested on his preparation and presentation. He could not rely on others to solve it for him. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he reviewed all the documents one more time. The maps, surveys, photographs, receipts, letters from previous owners, and excerpts from HOA rules were all organized into a single folder. Each piece told part of the story, and together they created a clear narrative. His cabin was legal, well-maintained, and outside the scope of the HOA's new rules. He felt a quiet satisfaction. He knew that the next step would be critical. He could feel the tension building, a mix of anticipation and determination. The HOA's threats were no longer abstract. They were tangible. But he was no longer unprepared. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, understanding the rules, and planning a strategy. Now he was ready to face the board, confident that facts, preparation, and calm composure would carry him through as he walked around the cabin that evening. He looked at each familiar detail, the deck, the garden, the shed, the creek nearby. Each one represented not just a physical structure, but years of care, attention, and investment. The cabin had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, and now it would face another test. He knew that the confrontation ahead would be challenging, but he also knew that the truth, backed by preparation and patience, would speak louder than threats ever could. By the end of this stage, he felt ready. The evidence was solid, the plan was clear, and his confidence had grown. The cabin, standing quietly among the trees, was no longer just a retreat. It was a symbol of persistence, preparation, and the quiet power of patience. Whatever came next with the HOA, he would face it armed not with anger, but with facts, calmness, determination. The morning of the meeting arrived, with a quiet stillness that seemed heavier than usual. He had been preparing for weeks, yet standing outside the small building where the HOA held its meetings brought a mix of nerves and determination. The sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He parked a few spaces away, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Today would be the moment when preparation met reality. Inside, the meeting room was modest, with a long table surrounded by chairs. A few residents were already seated, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to mild apprehension. The HOA board members occupied one side of the table, papers stacked neatly before them. They greeted him with a mix of formality and a subtle assumption that he would be compliant, a demeanor he had seen before. He returned their nods with calm, measured respect. Careful not to give any hint of nervousness, the meeting began with the usual introductions and procedural statements. The board read the items on the agenda, then turned to the reason for his presence, the alleged violations regarding his cabin. One of the board members spoke in a tone that combined authority and impatience, summarizing the claims from previous letters. They emphasized fines, potential penalties, and the need for immediate compliance. The words, though intended to intimidate, had no effect on him. He remained silent, listening carefully, noting every detail, and observing reactions. When the board member finished, he requested permission to respond. The chairman, slightly surprised by his composed tone, nodded. He stood, carrying his folder filled with meticulously organized documents, maps, photographs, and receipts. He began by thanking the board for allowing him to speak, and calmly stating that he wished to clarify the situation based on facts and evidence. His tone was respectful, yet firm. Immediately setting a different atmosphere in the room, he started with the history of the cabin. Using maps and property records, he demonstrated that the structure had been built decades before the HOA was established. He showed surveyor reports and permits, noting that the cabin had always complied with zoning and building regulations. Each document he presented was precise and easy to follow. The room grew quiet as board members exchanged subtle glances. Realizing that their assumptions might be flawed, he then addressed the specific claims mentioned in the letters, one by one. He referred to photographs and receipts proving that any alleged modifications had existed long before the HOA rules applied. The deck, the shed, and even the small garden were all documented with dates and explanations. Each piece of evidence directly contradicted the board's assertions, and he presented them without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. As he spoke, he noticed subtle changes in the board's demeanor. The confident authority they had exhibited before now showed signs of unease. Their questions became more cautious, less aggressive. They asked for clarifications, and he answered patiently, providing clear explanations and references to the supporting documents. The room, once tense with expectation, now carried a different energy, one of careful attention and growing realization. He also anticipated potential objections and had prepared responses. When a board member questioned whether certain paint colors or minor differences in construction could be considered violations, he referred to the HOA regulations themselves. He highlighted sections specifying that these rules applied only to new constructions or modifications after a certain date. His calm, factual explanation made it clear that the rules did not apply retroactively. The silence in the room deepened. Residents present for the meeting began to observe quietly, some leaning forward, others whispering softly to one another. They watched as he presented evidence and answered questions without losing composure. It became apparent that the meeting was no longer a formality. It had transformed into a moment of revelation. The narrative that the board had assumed that he had violated rules and needed correction was unraveling. Organized facts. He then turned to the human aspect of the matter. Speaking with subtle authority about fairness and respect, he emphasized that the cabin had been maintained with care, that it had been a peaceful presence in the neighborhood for years, and that any attempt to enforce outdated or inapplicable rules could disrupt the sense of community. He did not accuse the board or residents, but framed his argument around shared values and reason. The approach was measured and thoughtful, showing maturity and confidence without confrontation. At one point, a board member attempted to interrupt, suggesting that even if the cabin predated the HOA, it still required adjustments to fit community standards. He calmly responded that while he respected the board's role, the regulations clearly did not apply retroactively and that any enforcement outside those boundaries could be legally and ethically questionable. He referenced examples from past cases where boards had retreated when faced with clear documentation. The chairman paused, then nodded. Realizing that the discussion had shifted from assumptions to facts, he concluded his presentation by summarizing the key points: the cabin's history, its compliance with all relevant laws, the clear exemption under HOA rules, and the meticulous documentation supporting each claim. He spoke with quiet confidence, letting the evidence do most of the work, while his calm demeanor reinforced the seriousness of his case. By the end of his presentation, the energy in the room had changed completely. The board's authority was no longer unquestioned. The weight of facts and careful preparation had shifted the balance. The chairman, after a brief consultation with other board members, spoke next. His tone was noticeably different, more cautious and less commanding. He acknowledged the evidence presented and admitted that, based on the documentation, many of the claims were not applicable. There were moments of hesitation, brief glances exchanged among board members, as if they were processing the realization that their assumptions had been challenged. The room was silent, every word carrying weight. Residents began to murmur softly among themselves. Some whispered words of support, others expressed surprise at the thoroughness of the presentation. The atmosphere shifted from confrontation to acknowledgement. He remained standing, composed and respectful, observing without interruption. The change in energy was subtle but unmistakable. The HOA, which had entered the meeting with authority and threat, was now forced to acknowledge the validity of his position. He answered a few final questions, maintaining calm and clarity. Each response reinforced the central message: the cabin was lawful. The improvements were documented, and the HOA's rules did not apply retroactively. His preparedness left little room for further challenge. Board members attempted to phrase concerns diplomatically, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted. The room that had once felt intimidating now carried a sense of quiet concession. As the meeting neared its end, the chairman summarized the board's position. They would withdraw the enforcement actions, cancel any threatened fines, and acknowledge that the cabin was compliant with relevant regulations. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that the board had underestimated him, and that their assumptions had been corrected through patience, preparation, and clear presentation. He listened silently, absorbing the moment with quiet satisfaction rather than celebration. After the meeting, some residents approached him, offering quiet congratulations. A few apologized for the tension, admitting they had assumed the board's claims were accurate without knowing the full history. He thanked them politely, emphasizing that the outcome was the result of careful preparation and adherence to facts, not confrontation or argument. The cabin, he realized, had become a symbol not just of property ownership, but of the power of knowledge, patience, and composure in the face of intimidation. He left the building with a calm sense of accomplishment. The sunlight felt warmer as he walked to his car, the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls creating a sense of peace. For weeks, he had prepared meticulously, gathered evidence, and anticipated every challenge. The result was not just victory over a threat, but the validation of a principle that patience, clarity, and preparation can overcome even the most confident attempts at intimidation. Back at the cabin, he spent the evening reflecting. He walked around the property, looking at the deck, the shed, the garden, and the surrounding trees. Each detail, carefully documented and maintained, now stood as a testament to resilience. The quiet moments, the weeks of research, the careful observation of neighbors and rules all had led to this resolution. The cabin was safe, not because of anger or confrontation, but because of thoughtful preparation and unwavering calm. He also considered the lessons learned from the experience. The HOA's initial confidence had been based on assumptions, on reliance on intimidation rather than facts. By approaching the situation methodically, he had turned the dynamic around, demonstrating that knowledge and patience could speak louder than threats. He understood that conflict often tested character, and in this instance, calm and preparation had proven more powerful than aggression. Even as the sun set over the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin and yard, he felt a profound sense of peace. The confrontation with the HOA, while tense and stressful, had reinforced a belief he had long held, that clarity, persistence, and respect for the truth could resolve even the most challenging situations. He sat on the deck with a cup of tea, watching the light fade and the stars appear. Feeling a quiet satisfaction that went beyond the practical victory, he knew that life in the neighborhood would continue. That minor disagreements or misunderstandings might arise again, but he also knew he was prepared for them. The cabin, standing firmly on its land, was now more than a retreat. It was proof that careful preparation and calm resolve could protect not only property but peace of mind. In the quiet of the evening, he thought about the weeks of preparation, the careful research, the organization of documents, the observation of HOA dynamics, and the rehearsed responses. Each step had been necessary, each moment of patience critical. The meeting had shown that intimidation could be countered with evidence, that assumptions could be challenged with facts, and that composure could shift the balance of authority by the end of the day. The cabin felt even more like home than before, not just because it was safe, but because the experience had strengthened his connection to it. Every corner, every improvement, every small detail was a part of a narrative that now included not just personal enjoyment, but defense and resilience. The cabin had endured scrutiny, yet it remained intact, standing quietly as a symbol of persistence, preparation, and patience rewarded.